All right. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you, everyone. And you guys now have entered the upper echelons of transit nerddom for coming on a Wednesday night to a presentation on transit finance. I think since we do have an intimate gathering here that, I have I don't have that many slides, don't worry. But there's a lot of content here. If we end up making it more interactive, I think that's great. Then I'll try to repeat any questions for the folks on Zoom and we'll just see how it goes. So just a little quick introduction for me. I'm the transit manager for Santa Rosa City Bus. I've been with the City of Santa Rosa for 13 years. About half that time, I was a planner. I'm secretly a planner still. They don't let me too near the planning these days. But previous to that, worked for Nelson Niger Consulting for about 6 years with transit operators, a lot of different transit operators in California and throughout the country. And then got my start at Rhode Island Public Transit back east. So I went from a place where there was like one statewide MPO and like the simplest possible transit finance structure in a state that size to California and the Bay Area, which is like completely the opposite. So what I'm going to try to do today is demystify a little bit some of the major elements of transit finance in California and in the Bay Area. And I'm try not to lose you guys, try not to bore you to tears. We'll keep it moving. And I'm totally happy to answer any questions. And I also have some ringers here tonight. So obviously everyone knows Jared, and we also have Emily Betts of SMART and Robert Betts of Marin Transit here. And they are also extremely knowledgeable people. So we'll be looking to them for input, especially like this is a very bus-centric presentation. So there's rail stuff. We've got a rail person here to answer questions. So we can go ahead. So I just wanted to start off just by finding out what brought you here. Like I've got some slides. Are there particular topics or questions that you all are most interested in knowing about as we go through this presentation? Anybody want to offer anything? Yes. Yeah, just I think we're gonna take care of that because there's a lot of that in this. So, all right. Yeah, Dave. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer that one tonight, but that for the people on Zoom, it's a question about how do we increase our transit capacity if we're going to meet our greenhouse gas and other community goals, and that is a big question. And actually, one of my slides touches on a conversation happening at the state level that really does speak to that. So I will provide a little bit of information on that. All right, let's go on ahead. So transit finance, it's like a bad romance. It's complicated. Um, Here is like transit finance in one slide, right? Highly variable. The way we fund transit in this country and in California, we have a real patchwork of funding sources. So you're not going to find many transit agencies that have one, two, or three things that fund them. It's going to potentially be dozens of different revenue streams and grants between the operating and capital sides of the house. So I'm going to touch on some of those, not dozens, don't worry. Um, Capital funds, there's a lot of grant programs out there, either formula grants that come to transit agencies automatically or competitive grants they can apply for. Really hard to come by new transit operating money. And that speaks to Dave's question, how do we get more buses on the street? It's really hard to fund a major transit expansion because you need something like a new sales tax measure, expanded sales tax, or some new state funding source that is dedicated to operations. So that's very difficult, especially in a typical fiscal environment. And then transit funding is often very limited to specific uses. So a lot of times we get questions as transit agencies, well, you just got that big grant. Why can't you use it for this? And, we just can't most of the time. It's typically the programs are very specialized and focused on specific projects or uses of the funds. So it tends to be rather inflexible. And then the last point is, fares don't cover operations and they shouldn't. And so a key point, I think many people in this room, it's pretty savvy group know this, transit fares may only cover, you know, 5% of the operation, 20% of the operation. If you have a really dense, a highly used rail system in a dense place, you could have like 70%, but we're not going to get to complete cost recovery through transit fares. And we really shouldn't. If we charged what we need to at City Bus to cover our costs, we'd be charging between like $5 and $10 a ride. And with, 86% low income ridership, that's going to just mean nobody rides, right? And then we don't get that money anyway. So it really speaks to the value of ridership that we shouldn't be looking to user fees to fund transit. Transit is there as a public good and to accomplish a lot of our other goals. And so, fares are just one small piece of the puzzle in most cases for bus. Next slide. So this is a slide that I want you to take with a grain of salt. This has been floating around for several years. I'm sure there's an updated version of it somewhere, but I just pulled it because it's an outdated but good illustration of this patchwork I'm talking about. So what this shows is the the proportion of different funding sources for different Bay Area transit operators. So you've got Muni and BART, VTA, AC Transit, all the way across to County Connection, bus operator in Contra Costa County over on the right. And you'll see on the right-hand side, you've got everything from parking citations, general fund, bridge tolls, property taxes, STA, sales tax. I'll talk about those a little bit later in the presentation. But what you can see here is that, how these funds are used and the proportion of the operating budget really varies. So you've got, Muni with 30%, this is pre-pandemic, but 30% of their operating budget coming from parking citations. And then you've got, Golden Gate Transit and SFA Ferry that have nearly half their operating budgets coming from bridge tolls. And then you've got, VTA, almost their entire operating budget is from their local sales tax, which is a very large sales tax, and they get a lot of it. And then, fare revenue varies widely. You've got Caltrain over here with, close to 70% fare recovery, whereas, County Connection there on the right, it's a little bit more like where we are in Sonoma County with like 14%. Of their operating budget coming from fares. So this just kind of gives you an idea of the patchwork and how different it can be from county to county and operator to operator. And this also varies a lot by mode, whether it's rail or ferry or bus. Okay, next slide, please. So quick snapshot. I'm going to use City Bus, my system that I know well, as a way to walk through some of the major transit operating sources. And part of the reason I'm using City Bus is that the way we fund transit in Santa Rosa is pretty similar to how it's funded in Petaluma and how Sonoma County Transit is funded. So for local bus transit in Sonoma County, these are kind of the big funding sources, right? So I'm just going to walk through them, try not to get into too much detail, but if there's questions, certainly feel free to ask. Go to the next slide. So start off, I'm just going to work my way around the pie. Federal funds make up about a 15% of our budget. That's really unusual. Most transit agencies, larger ones, can't use federal funds for operating. We're small, and the current Federal Transportation Act allows us to use a certain percentage of our budget for operations, which we do. Leaves us a little vulnerable to if the Transportation Act changes, but we're sticking with it for now. So this money gets apportioned out to urbanized areas across the country by this gigantic, crazy formula. We all report data into that formula every year. They run it through the sausage grinder and spit out apportionments to different urbanized areas. And then there's a locally determined process to suballocate that funding out. Most of the Bay Area is subject to what's called the Transit Capital Priorities system or process administered by MTC. I'm not going to get into that. It's super complicated. Actually, not that complicated, but we don't want to go down that rabbit hole right now. In Santa Rosa, we have just a multi-operator split agreement among SMART, Sonoma County Transit, and City Bus. And Petaluma is a little different. I'm sure Jared can speak to that if there's questions. So federal funds typically, as I said, go for capital projects only. We take advantage of the exception for operations for small operators. You do have to have local match. So sometimes there's an awesome federal grant you want to go after, but if you don't have the 20 to 50% local revenue to match it, you can't go for it. So having that local match available can be really important. These are the least flexible funds overall. And, if $1 of federal money touches a project, it's federalized, and that comes with a whole host of regulatory requirements. And so you have to be a little strategic about how you use federal funds. Next slide. So general fund, this is important for people to know. We're a city owned and operated system, much like Petaluma Transit. People all the time think that the city pays for the transit system because why wouldn't it? It's another city service. But most city and county-owned systems are not part of the general fund. They're actually enterprises. They're self-supporting through external funds and user fees. So that's certainly the case for Santa Rosa City Bus. Historically, we haven't had any general fund participation in the transit system, though, of course, lots of other support. But we do currently receive $30,000 a year for a council-initiated fare-free program for veterans. And that's important. It reimburses the lost fare revenue, and that comes into play later when we talk about things like fare box recovery requirements. But yeah, it's not a big part of our operating budget. So that's just something I want to make sure people understand that's pretty true of most city and county systems. There's no general fund. All right, going to fares. This includes everything that goes into the fare box, all the cash, any money we get for selling bus passes, Clipper cards. And then we get reimbursement for most of, if not all of our fare-free programs. So for our youth program, we're reimbursed, much like Petaluma was before they went, well, I guess maybe that money is still in the mix. Yeah, okay. And we have the fare-free program with Santa Rosa Junior College that's reimbursed through the student fee. So all that money goes into fare box revenue. This 7.4% is way lower than it used to be. This is like a post-pandemic thing, right? Our ridership is down. We haven't raised fares in 12 years. Costs have gone up continuously throughout that time. So, we're seeing the impact of that in our fare recovery. Increasing fares comes at a cost, though. There's a concept called fare elasticity. When you increase fares, you lose a certain proportion of your ridership. And so we've continued to place the value on the ridership and the access, keep our fares really low, make it as accessible as possible, and get the ridership gain and the access and equity gain from that. But it does mean that this wedge gets smaller and smaller, especially post-pandemic. So another point I just want to make, this is a small part of our operating budget, but it's still $1.3 million. So, we get asked a lot about fare-free transit, especially with Petaluma being fare-free. And, for us, the challenging part is without having a way to backfill that revenue, that would be a $1.3 million service cut, right? And what our priority is on is the service quality, making sure that we continue to sustain and improve as much as we can the service we have in terms of the span of service, frequency, et cetera. So for us, it's not an easy thing to let go of because it would definitely have service impacts. Next slide, please. All right, so moving on to Measure M, our local quarter-cent sales tax for transportation. We're really lucky to have that. Currently, 10% of Measure M goes to local transit. It's sub-allocated by population to Santa Rosa, Sonoma County, and Petaluma. The Go Sonoma measure that was just passed, the reauthorization of Measure M, will raise that share to 18%, which is fantastic. There's a few little additional increments to support fare-free transit programs and first mile, last mile type services. One thing I do want to say, this is a relatively modest Bay Area wide, though. I mean, super grateful for it, but you go down to Marin County, I think it's 55% for local transit. So that's a significant, and I think it's a half-cent measure, right? So half-cent measure instead of quarter-cent measure, 55% for local transit as opposed to, 10 to 18. So, it is something that, maybe at some point in the future, we'll have the opportunity to increase and then provide even more support for local transit. But in the meantime, it was a real win that Go Sonoma is allocating some additional revenue our way within about a year. And that will go to augment and improve transit service. Next slide. Okay, state transit assistant. We're getting to the big dogs now. We're getting to STA and TDA. These typically make up the largest portion of the operating budgets for smaller bus operators in the Bay Area and throughout California. So I'm going to actually show these in a different way in a couple slides, but just to touch on the high points. State transit assistance is generated by a state sales tax on diesel fuel. Half of the revenues are allocated to the region according to their share of the state population. The other half of the revenues are allocated directly to operators based on their share of the statewide transit revenues. So most of us here locally don't get very much from the revenue-based funds because we don't bring in that much revenue compared to a lot of bigger operators. But we do get a bigger chunk through the population-based funds. And I'll talk about how those get distributed in more detail in a couple slides. These do fluctuate with fuel sales. So, diesel fuel consumption goes down, our funds go down. That's sort of an issue with, electrification that needs to be corrected at some point in time. And this is currently suspended, but one thing that's been a bit challenging at times is there's a cost efficiency requirement related to CPI. We're constantly evaluated annually to see if we stay within certain cost efficiency parameters, and that's what determines our eligibility for STA. So if you have a paratransit contract that had a big spike in costs, or say, some other aspect of your operation, a labor cost or a service cost increase significantly or several increase significantly, it can be really challenging to stay within that cost efficiency. That's currently suspended due to the impacts of the pandemic, and we're waiting to see kind of how that all plays out in the next few years. These funds are super flexible, so bring them on. Same with the TDA. So let's go to the TDA slide. So TDA is the real big dog. This has been the cornerstone of California state transit funding since the early 1970s when the Transportation Development Act was passed. Again, this is, we're lucky to have this in California. I mean, there's a lot of states. I'm going to take it. Oh, there's my husband. Hi. Thanks for coming. So I'm going to tell a little anecdote. I got my start working in Rhode Island, and at that time, we didn't have anything like a TDA, any direct allocation from the state legislature for transit. We had a statewide transit system, as you would expect in Rhode Island. But every December, we would have to do a doomsday scenario. So the whole planning department would stop working, do a doomsday scenario, which would be like what we would do if the state legislature didn't give us our funding for the coming fiscal year. Every year we did it. It took like a month. So being in a place where the state has actually invested in a fairly significant allocation of resources that just come automatically to transit operators is pretty awesome. So anyway, it's generated by a 0.5-cent sales tax. That can be good, it can be bad. If the economy is good, sales tax is up. It's great for us. If there's a recession, it can be really, really difficult, especially because TDA makes up such a big part of a lot of our operating budgets. The tax receipts come back to the county of origin, and then there's a distribution process that's, in Sonoma County, it's subject to an agreement that goes back to actually the 1980s. Where 25% of the Sonoma County revenue goes off the top to Golden Gate Transit, and then the remainder currently is distributed among the local bus operators by population. And again, there's a stipulation here around fare box recovery. TDA requires that we achieve a 20% fare box recovery to maintain eligibility for funds. We were barely squeaking by before the pandemic, counting not only our true fare revenue as well as Measure M, which can be counted as a local fare revenue source. Now there's nowhere near, we're nowhere near that. And that's true for most operators right now. So that is something that is currently suspended, and there's a state process that we'll be looking at whether fare box recovery continues to be a useful metric for these funds. And I'm just going to editorialize here a little bit because I feel very strongly about it. I think with our climate goals, with our equity goals around transit ridership, trying to get as much money out of people is probably not the policy goal that we should be focused on. And there probably is a different and better metric for where we are today in terms of evaluating eligibility for these funding sources. So editorial complete. Because it's so flexible, TDA is usually the last dollar in. And then anything that's not needed can stay in our reserves. So City Bus's entire operating reserve is TDA, and we just keep it in case of, a capital reserve need, an operating reserve need. And so it's, super important to our whole financial approach. And so here's another way of looking at it. That's just a little flow chart, vastly simplified, for the California Transportation Development Act. So on the left, the two programs, STA and TDA, are the main components of the California Transportation Development Act. TDA is also known as Local Transit Fund. Everyone just calls it TDA. Quarter-cent sales tax comes back to the county of origin. And then here in Sonoma County, as discussed, we have the formula that distributes a quarter to Golden Gate Transit and the remainder to the local bus operators. And then we have the State Transit Assistance Program, the sales tax on diesel, which comes 50% by population to our region. It comes to MTC. So MTC actually has policy discretion over these funds, and that's an important thing to remember. MTC not only distributes these funds out to the transit operators, but uses it for other regional programs. And really it's subject to MTC's discretion. So even though MTC works with all of us and really wants to keep as much transit operating funding in the mix as possible, it's not like a guarantee, right? Because at the end of the day, if there are other regional priorities or needs, that allocation could shift a bit. So anyway, it comes down to Sonoma County from MTC. And then we have a distribution formula here that this kind of oversimplifies it, but most of it goes to the bus operators by population, but we do have a kind of performance tier that's split between SMART and the bus operators. both these formulas are kind of in discussion right now because this agreement has expired and we need to renegotiate among the parties. And then this is sort of under discussion, like just taking another look at it in terms of where we are today with transit in Sonoma County. And then these two sources come through SCTA and action at SCTA to then finally allocate them out to transit operators. So I wanted to take a little bit longer on those because they're so important. That's kind of how they flow. I'm going to ask if any of my transit ringers have anything to add to any of that, or did I misspeak? Jared, do you want the mic?
Worth noting is, of course, the smart sales tax, which is a quarter-cent sales tax in both Sonoma and Marin, which is very helpful, and also transit funds worth considering. No, you actually did a great job covering it very well. So
Yeah, thank you for that. And yeah, so Measure Q for SMART. Yeah, so that's obviously a hugely important piece of the puzzle for our transit network in Sonoma County, and we'll be up for reauthorization very soon in 2026, probably something like that. We'll see. Anyway, it's coming up for reauthorization, so that's just important for everyone to know that you know, we have that work to do to ensure that SMART continues to have its funding. Next slide. Okay, so this is a really boring slide, but here, all I'm trying to achieve here is to show, you know, while I've been focusing on operating funding, because I think that was the primary interest for this forum, it's the same patchwork on the capital side. So if you want to buy buses, build a facility, upgrade a facility, buy electric vehicle chargers, you know, anything that has to do with transit capital, you're still piecing together funds. I mean, we have probably a couple dozen grants in our capital program right now. It's insane. But so there's federal funds from multiple programs. There's formula funding, but there's also competitive grant funding if you need like a bigger dollar amount for a big project. Very competitive nationwide. There's some state funds, some new ones that have come online from cap and trade auction revenues, which is pretty cool. But those are, for the most part, competitive. There's some new programs supporting transit fleet electrification. So again, it kind of speaks also to the issue that a lot of these programs are very specific to certain project types. And so you've got to fit your project or your goal kind of within the policy framework of these different funding sources. There's regional funds such as the Transportation Fund for Clean Air, which is an air district funding program. Regional measures like Regional Major 3 that's funded by bridge tolls can generate transit capital. There's a bunch of others. I'm just kind of talking about the ones that City Bus and like a lot of the local operators on the bus side take care of or take advantage of. A whole bunch of other stuff on the rail side, which I can't even speak to, but Emily's nodding sagely and giving me a knowing look. Yes, there's a whole bunch. So imagine this patchwork just like blown up to include ferry and rail and every other mode, right? And again, I've already emphasized this, that capital grants tend to be extremely restrictive. We can't use them for operating. We can't change our mind and say, oh, you know what, we actually want to move it to this project. It's very difficult to reprogram these funds once they've been awarded. So it's just, you know, a challenge that we navigate. All right, next slide, please. So I'd be remiss if I wrapped up without talking about sort of the structural context for transit finance in California. And the biggest issue, and I think this is felt by most transit operators throughout the state, is that, you know, even with the operating revenue we get over time, over years, the revenue growth does not keep up with the costs, right? So the purchase power of a TDA dollar gets like less and less over time gradually. And so many transit operators feel like they're kind of in a cycle, like every certain number of years, there's a little service cut, and then there's another little service cut. And so, you know, it sort of speaks to the issue Dave raised about, you know, not only how do we expand transit, but how do we make sure that we fund transit in a way that we're not in this like slow attrition process in terms of our transit service quality. And that's not necessarily true in every system, but it's a very common theme when you talk to transit operators around the state. And one thing I'll say, you know, labor costs are a big part of that right now. I mean, we live in a very expensive state. People got to be able to live. And that's been a real pressure recently, especially coming out of the pandemic. But really, the costs of goods, the costs of vehicles, everything is costing a lot more. So this is a real challenge we're all facing right now. This group is probably very familiar with the fiscal cliff for transit post-pandemic. This is a major issue in the Bay Area, so I just wanted to touch on it briefly. A combination of the dramatic changes in travel behavior after the pandemic, greater rates of work from home, lower transit ridership, challenges around restoring services post-pandemic because of, operator availability, fleet availability, or just funding, means that, the issue has kind of become exacerbated. With some of the inner Bay Area fiscal operators really having very significant existential levels of fiscal crisis on the horizon. There's some initial state support that came down from SB 125, but that's limited term. So there's a real process and thought and work right now around what do we do long term to get out of this situation and get back on a more stable fiscal footing, sort of industry wide. So next slide, I stole these slides from MTC. These are not my slides, but I cited them here if you want to go learn more. So this is just an example of that. So this shows the regions over the whole 9-county Bay Area region. This was the mix of revenue back pre-pandemic, fiscal 18-19. On the right, you'll see the mix of revenue in the last fiscal year, 23-24. So one of the major things you see is just what's happened to fares, right? So less so for our systems up here. Our ridership recovery is actually very good, but especially for some of the commute-oriented inner Bay Area services, ridership just has not recovered. And that's really hit them very hard in the fare box to the point that that orange wedge over there, the federal COVID relief that has been received, is kind of propping up those systems for the time being, but that's running out. Next slide, please. And this is just another way of looking at it, comparing BART on the left to VTA in Santa Clara County, just in terms of how this plays out. So, you'll see here in the green bar, that's fiscal 19 fares, 53% of BART's operating revenue. Last year it was 21%. With that gap, the orange is the federal COVID relief that's filling the gap right now to a tune of several $100 million, right, for just 1 year. And then over on the right, VTA has a very different story where they have a very large allocation of local sales tax revenue. Sales tax has kind of come out of the pandemic okay. So they're in pretty good shape. I don't know if they would say that, but relatively speaking, they're in pretty good shape. And then they also have the TDA and STA funds, which are that sort of gray bar at the bottom. So, certainly a very more stable funding mix for VTA than what BART is dealing with. And that's why there is so much work being done right now for those operators that have this type of scenario. Next slide. Okay, so if you want to get more into the geekery of transit finance, here's just a couple of suggestions I'm wrapping up with. The Metropolitan Transportation Commission website has all sorts of information. You can go deep on any of these funding sources, at least any of the regional and state funding sources. SETA is a great place to learn more about Measure M and Go Sonoma. If you really want to get in the weeds, you can go pull the Sonoma County Coordinated Claim. It's usually on the April-May SCTA board meeting, and that's where you would see how we allocate the TDA and the STA, the Measure M, all those funding. Yep, Jared's got one right here. Oh, yeah. Yeah, okay, so we can go there. Cool. And then a couple larger processes going on just to make sure people are aware of. Because of the fiscal cliff situation in the Bay Area, MTC and the operators and the state legislature have been working to try to put together a revenue measure to be able to generate some relief for the fiscal cliff. Y'all may have heard of SB 1031 that ended up not moving forward in the legislative session. There's currently a process to try to put together the successor to SB 1031. And so that's happening through a Transportation Revenue Measure Select Committee at MTC. You can go on MTC's website. You can watch those meetings. You can look at the materials. Those charts I stole were from those meetings. So there's a lot of really interesting financial information being presented there. And then at the state level, there is the State Transit Transformation Task Force that's trying to grapple with these issues on like a statewide level, which is an extremely big lift. But you can also check that out, watch the meetings, look at the agenda packets, and really totally geek out to like the nth degree. So with that, I think I just have a slide that has questions, comments, any discussion. And Jared, did you have anything you wanted to add more before sorry, I'm cutting you all off.
I have a second mic here, and if we can, for the sake of Zoom and recording, if we can get people up here.
Great.
Thank you, Rachel. A few random kind of notes I jotted down during the great presentation. Yeah, I agree. The transit funding is very complicated and complex, but it's a good thing overall. You talked about Rhode Island. When I come from Colorado, they also did not have a dedicated enterprise sales tax or transit funding measure like we do. If you have that, it's generally always a local measure, say in like the Denver metro region. And so that's very much a great thing that, again, California is blessed to have. So despite the complex patchwork of grant funds, one of the things that really surprised me when I moved out here by comparison to Colorado. I think it is a great thing overall. You talked about city general fund. We similarly in Petaluma get a small amount of that. That actually increased thanks to city council recently when we started our fair program July 1st. We get 180,000 from that to help cover the cost of the program. And part of that is also to cover that fair recovery ratio, as Rachel mentioned. And so it's kind of twofold there, but that's really just to make that program fare free to answer kind of the initial question of this event. How is it paid for? And the good thing with that program is if you can afford to do it, it's really one of the most cost effective ways to increase ridership. We've only been running it about a month and seen about a 40% increase so far. It's great. But for each agency, it's a bit different how much that cost is, whether they can put it. And it's not even just the cost of the fare revenue, it's how much service you may have to add. You want a bus to be 100% full. You don't want it to necessarily be 101% full because then you're adding another bus out there and need another vehicle and driver and things like that. We had pretty good bandwidth on the majority of our service. Didn't anticipate and haven't really seen huge overloads yet. We've added a few more trips on school trippers, but so far so good. Most grants, as you mentioned, as great as they are, they're often capital. The hardest piece is to get the operating funds. And then the capital ones always have the local match, as you mentioned. So even if you're an agency that's really aggressive with going after grants, it's only one piece of the puzzle. The hardest piece to get is really the operating side. So if you want to expand service on the street, that's even harder to do. With electric buses, if you want to be really progressive as an agency, like in Sonoma County, although there are grants like HVIP to cover the cost delta of those versus diesel, and they're about 500,000 or so more per bus to get electric versus diesel, it doesn't cover the full delta. And it's a mandate that we all have to be zero emission by 2040 at the latest, depending on transit agency size. But if you want to be even more aggressive, like Petaluma is trying to be with being zero emission by 2030, then you're spending more money up front, which you have to fund through other sources. And every dollar you put in from things like TDA is less money that you can put towards operations because that's your flexible funding. So that's a trade-off. And then a lot of it, to answer your kind of question, Dave, as we transition the questions, is how do you fund more? I think with the systems you look at for Petaluma and for Santa Rosa, really the systems you see are kind of the system you get with the current funding levels. If you really want to take it to the next level that you see other places in like San Francisco or elsewhere, I think you really have to have the discussion on all those different options that Rachel outlined, whether that's things like sales tax measures, even parking revenue measures. Those are the kind of things you have to look at. And fortunately, there's a lot of great models even nearby, such as the Marin County one, having the half cent versus the quarter cents, and what that provides for more of that service that lets you put service out on the street, operating funds. So I think that's one of the answers to that I think we'll discuss more. And then there's also kind of the expansion side. Every time you want to build more and put more service out on the street, it's not as simple as just we're going to run buses more. You need more buses. You need more drivers. You need more mechanics. In our case, you may need a new maintenance facility. We're pretty much at capacity right now. We couldn't fit 10 more buses, even if we could solve all those other problems tomorrow. Facility-wise, we just don't have that capacity. So those are a lot of the considerations that go into really building out that dream system you want to where, you know, a large percentage of your trips are in transit. Several pieces you have to plan well in advance to really get to that end goal. And that's it for me.
Awesome. Great. Thanks for that. Questions? Yeah.
How is it that you track ridership when there's a fare-free situation? And this is a question for the bus, but also for SMART, when you've got free fares for seniors, you know, they're not necessarily tagging on and tagging off. So how do you track them?
That's a great question. So every transit agency does it a little bit different. Some will have smart fare boxes to where you're entering each type. Back when we had fares, we would have about 15 different options on that. So you could be an adult paying cash fare. You could be a youth using a monthly pass. One of the things with switching to fare free is that goes away. So generally what we're doing is we're breaking it up into 3 categories now: youth, adult, senior, and then disabled. So the drivers are trying to do their best to kind of estimate it. But really what becomes important is a lot of the survey data, a lot of that data that you get that's informed by the fares and how people are paying when they get on the bus and pay. We no longer have that. So you have to use those other data sources and sort of extrapolate it over your ridership. So you still do get that data and know adults versus youth versus senior, what ridership fluctuations can be attributed to each.
Sure, I can answer that question. Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Betts. I'm planning manager for SMART. So we did switch to free fares for youth and seniors starting April 1st. It's been tremendously successful so far. On SMART, we have an automated passenger accounting system. It's called an APC system. And we only installed it, I don't know, a year and a half, 2 years ago. It works very well. It's almost 100% accurate. So we have actual numbers of ridership boardings to fall back on, which is really nice. We are sending staff out to do sampling, which means like randomized counts of youth and seniors on different trips to get an estimate of those numbers. Based on the past couple months, we've seen around a 20% increase in youth and a 25% increase in seniors. If you look at the census data, I could talk a long time about this, but if you look at the census data, you'll see that youth and seniors combined make up 46% of the population in Sonoma and Marin counties. And what we're seeing based on our estimates is that we just hit that. We just hit 45% of riders on SMART are combined youth and seniors with the free fare program. So we feel like the estimates are about right.
Yeah, and we similarly, most transit agencies, I think all of us have automated passenger counters. It's good, it tells you counts, but a rider is a rider is a rider. It doesn't say who they are, what type of fare, things like that. That's where those other pieces of data come in.
Other questions? Yeah.
Yes, it is helpful. I love those numbers. So we still do get some clipper tags from youth and seniors, and it is nice to see those. Yes. And adults are still 100% tagging on, so we have that number that we can back out of the APC number.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's such an easy question. That gave me a real softball, Dave. For the people on Zoom, the question was, what are my thoughts on transit consolidation, which is like a huge, enormous topic. So I have a lot of thoughts. I think sometimes it's appropriate and makes sense for a community or a county or region. It's worked very successfully in other parts of California to merge transit systems. There's, examples here in the Bay Area and throughout California. I think you have to be a little careful. I think you have to understand what potentially the downsides are of consolidation. Sometimes if you're raising everyone to the highest wage, highest benefits package of multiple operators, then your costs go up. It could result in service impacts. It's not something that should be gone into without quite a bit of thought and study. That said, I think sometimes it really can make a lot of sense because there are efficiencies to be gained, and there certainly are usability gains for riders to be achieved through having one system. There's counterpoints to that as well. Sometimes when you have your smaller systems, you can be a little bit more nimble, a little bit more responsive to local needs in a particular area. I do think that the work we're doing through the Transit Integration and Efficiency Study here in Sonoma County and the mascots process, which we can talk more about. That actually would be an awesome forum, future forum, once we get a little farther down the road. But Mascots is a joint Marin-Sonoma County transit service planning exercise focused on the 101 corridor that we're literally all involved. All the people, transit people in the room are all in meetings together frequently. You know, there's a lot we can achieve without consolidating, and it's still hard. It's still really challenging. The devil's in the details with it, but you know, there are plenty of examples of throughout the country of multi-operator integrated systems where the agencies remain administratively separate, but from the standpoint of the rider, it functions like one system, right? It's seamless, and it's one fair payment structure, procedure, policy. It's one set of public information that's integrated. It's a service planning group that's planning for the entire network, agnostic of specific operators, really looking at how all those different systems work together best to serve the markets and the rider needs. So I personally think that the work we're doing in that vein is really beneficial because we can get a lot of the benefits of consolidation without hitting a lot of the immediate roadblocks that can happen when you start to talk about administrative consolidation of systems. So I could go on and on about that, but there are some real significant challenges with full consolidation that I think can get us off course from doing the things we need to do to make a better system for the riders. So that's kind of like a wishy-washy answer, but I actually think it's my real answer. I don't know. Okay, I'm glad you thought it was good. Okay, cool. All right, thanks, Dave. Other questions? Yeah.
So the Denver metro area, it's sort of the exact opposite of the Bay Area. We have kind of the tyranny of too many transit agencies, so to speak, in the Bay Area, over 27 or so. I forget the exact number. In the Denver metro region, they have one agency. So some people would like to move the Bay Area towards that, but I've seen both ends of the spectrum and they have pros and cons. It's actually really nice to have the model we have in Petaluma, that you have a lot more say, a lot more immediacy on the changes to your system. You know that there's good return to source on your funding, that the money you get is being put into your specific system and city. Part of what's hard about that is when I was in Boulder near Denver in the Denver metro area, it was one pocket of the area, one person on a 14-member board representing you. Very hard to get things done if you want to do something different, even like increase service levels and you have money to contribute. You often got pushback from other parts of the region. Why did they get more service, even if they're contributing more money? So I've seen very much the downsides of having only one system region-wide. I think it's easier and you get the benefits of it simpler, but there are kind of trade-offs. So I don't know, there's been a major consolidation there. Overall, I would say it's more consolidated. There's really 3 or 4 major transit operators in Colorado. RTD is the one in the Denver metro region. The second biggest one is called Roaring Fork for some of the mountainous areas like Aspen. Colorado Springs has their own under the city. So it's not quite the same as it is in the Bay Area where there's several transit agencies basically with adjacent operating areas. It's a bit more segmented and spread out there in Colorado in particular.
I was just going to ask if either of our other transit industry folks in the room have an answer or a thought, additional thoughts or different thoughts about consolidation. No. Okay. Just wanted to offer. It's a hot topic. Robert's thinking about it, I can tell. Do you have any thoughts you would like to? No. Okay. All right. All right. Well,
you'll have to ask him afterwards.
Yeah, I know. Well, I was kind of shooting glances at both of them while I was answering. I'm like, are we on the same page? Anyway. All right. Yeah, it's a challenging topic and there's a lot of good answers. So other questions? Yeah.
Oh. I just wondered, in terms of not percentage, but real numbers, and how full are the buses since going free?
No problem. So the question for people on Zoom is how full are the buses after going fare free? The answer is it somewhat varies. You know, similar to the roadway, you often hear from people like, how full is the bus? Why isn't the bus more full? But often it's kind of similar to roadways. I think when the roads are really congested and people are only focusing on that, not paying attention to the buses, that's also when the buses are really full and you get higher ridership. So it depends time of the day, really. For our school tripper routes, those can be 100% loaded. We're actually disproportionately large with our student ridership for Petaluma. We get about 60% of our riders are K through 16 students. And so those trips will be anywhere like 100% full. And then the ones later at night, those may be about 10% full, because with transit, it's not always even throughout the day. It's kind of a balance of, you know, productivity of the service and then providing the lifeline that people need if they're relying on transit, making sure they have options all the way throughout the course of the day. Do you have thoughts? Do you have a specific number? I don't know.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that she was probably most interested in Petaluma. I mean, I think the same is true for a lot of our systems. I think one thing we hear a lot is the buses are driving around empty. And, I think because of some of those patterns you discuss, I mean, we know like the load factor on our buses, like the average load factor, they're about half full. But you will see buses at certain times. They're coming back from dropping off a bunch of people. There might be two people on there. So anyway, I don't know if that plays in as well, but I think certainly from the standpoint of going fare free, I mean, we've seen the programs we do have where we offer fare free service, like for youth, we've seen, really significant increases in ridership as well. And certainly like our buses are running around at bell times much, much more full than they were before, like packed. We've had to add extra trips.
And like I mentioned, with fare free, that's one of the good things for us is the vast majority of our trips, we have that good capacity. And so you want every seat on that bus full. It's already out there running. There's really marginal added costs to go from 10 people to 12 people. The bus is out there running, the driver's on it, there's minimal impact to fuel. So really you want to get as many of those riders as you can, especially if you're collecting revenue. That's like a big piece of the puzzle. But ridership impacts several of those pieces that Rachel talked about before. A lot of the formula funds can be impacted that way. So you want to help people. That's the biggest reason you want ridership, but there is a funding kind of tie into that. Yeah, so the question is about the timing of the Petaluma Fare Free program. We started July 1st, 2024. We're calling it a 1-year pilot right now, but generally the plan is to keep it going indefinitely. We want to see what the impacts are. We've had a lot of discussions in advance as what are some potential changes. But if all goes well with the program, which it seems to be going so far, the plan is to keep that going indefinitely.
Is there any indication that the additional riders are people who are getting out of their cars? So is this impacting traffic?
Well, that's a great question. We've yet to do a lot of post-implementation survey. We're hoping to do one in a few months that'll answer that question more. When I've done fare-free programs elsewhere, like I did one in Colorado in a city called Longmont, a lot of the questions were, who are the new riders? What is the increase? Some people are hoping you get a lot of new riders out who weren't riding before, and that's a piece of it. But honestly, what we found is the biggest increase in ridership are a lot of people riding now. It's low income people. But even with transit fares, if they're low, people are still doing the calculus and the trade-off every day. They can still maybe only afford one round trip on the bus. So they're only going to work. They're not going shopping like they'd like, maybe doctor's appointments. So actually what you find is the existing riders are riding more. So you may actually be creating trips in that sense. But overall, it's a great thing because you're helping those people out from the social equity standpoint. And you do get turnout, I don't know, maybe 10 to 20% of new riders out there riding the bus who weren't riding it before. But there are so many factors that go into why you ride the bus. Fares are only one of them. And I think a lot of people that don't ride as often, the things that really get them out there riding more, fares is one component, but it's things like how convenient the service is, how often it runs. Can I go out there 10 minutes and not have to worry about a schedule and know it's going to show up? Is the trip time competitive to if I drive my cars, it take 3 times longer? People are doing all that math in their head. If they don't do it intentionally, subconsciously they do it. So you really have to improve all of those areas if you want to maximize your ridership. The fares is a big piece of it, but it's just one piece of that. Well, that's true. I mean, really, when you bump up buses to run every 15 minutes or more often, you do get a lot of new riders out because then you get more of the spontaneous ridership. When it's every 30 or 60 minutes, it's harder for people to ride. You don't want to miss the only bus and wait for 59 minutes. If you go out there and it runs every 15 or every 10, you're more comfortable going out there maybe without a schedule. If you miss a bus, you know, you're not waiting too long and you're going to be late to work or a doctor's appointment. So really, once you start getting into those numbers, 15 minutes or more, it really starts to change the dynamic and you get a lot more people riding who hadn't rode transit much before.
And I think the other benefit of, you know, the 15-minute headways as many places as possible, it just makes it so much easier to plan transfers between systems, right? I mean, if we could have 15-minute connections to SMART, 15-minute connections to some of our other regional inner city routes, I mean, I think that would really change a lot of people. I mean, I think about it for myself, living in Petaluma and working in Santa Rosa. You know, sometimes of day the connection works, some, you know, and I can make a real quick trip up to Santa Rosa and then connect to city bus. Other times it just doesn't work as well, and I choose to drive. So even though I'm someone who would prefer to take transit all the time if I could. So, you know, that's another beautiful thing about having that level of service. It just makes the whole network work better.
And I think the kind of connectivity to like SMART, for example, that's a good piece. It's hard if you're only running every 30 or 60 minutes, especially in Petaluma. Generally, the ridership is pretty even. We're generally mid-corridor. I think we're the most road station, Petaluma. Yep, still are. But we're not the north end of this line, the south end, where you know the patterns. Like if you're far north, people are going to get on in the morning, right? Ride south in the afternoon, go back. Petaluma is pretty well evenly split, and Emily can speak more to this. So it's hard if you have a bus connecting that runs every 30 minutes or definitely every 60, because it's, are you getting people to the train so they can transfer to it and doing the first mile, or are you picking them up after the train and doing final mile to get them to their job? It's hard if you're running like a headway based service and it's only every hour. It's trade-offs and there's no great option. You're not going to be able to do both well unless you do other services, you know, like microtransit or whatever. Or if you run every 10 minutes, that's really like the best option, 10 or 15 minutes, then you're hitting either way. You don't really have to make that bad offset and you're covered with both options if you can afford it, but that's obviously the big catch.
Somebody pointed out today, transit subsidy. Put some of that towards equitable transportation mode.
You're hired, Dan. Sounds good. Let's do it. Let's do it.
Looks like we are out of questions.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much. No, I that all I can say.
Okay.
But again, thank you. Great presentation.
Thank you. Awesome. Thank you guys. Thank you guys so much. You were such an engaged audience for what can be a very dry topic. So much appreciated. And thank you, Jared.
Thank you. Maybe the lowest attended day, but one of the best presentations.
And no, Zoom also.
Oh, great.
And this may be our best recording of it yet.
All right.